Let's see. All right. We're live here. My name is Jared Mello, and this is Radical Self-Respect with Jared Mello. Today, I have a special guest. His name is Mac Haddow. He's a special fellow. And for what was it again? Special fellow?
Senior fellow on public policy.
Senior fellow in public policy. I got to remember that. But he works with the AKA as well. And I wanted to get his thoughts and opinions on what we're up against here. Because from what I understand, the FDA is going to meet with the UN and going to meet with the WHO, and they're going to talk about scheduling Kratom internationally.
That's correct. And the process that we're confronting here, and by the way, it's a surprise because this is clearly a way for the FDA to circumvent the Controlled Substances Act provisions that are in place here in the United States that protect Americans. And in two occasions, the FDA has failed to meet the criteria that's necessary for scheduling. So what has apparently been done is the FDA has gone to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and the process is that before the UN Commission can act, they solicit the assistance of the World Health Organization through the expert committee. And currently we are under notice that they will convene a pre-review of Kratom along with a couple of other substances that they'll evaluate whether or not they should proceed to a critical review that would take place over the next year about whether Kratom should then ultimately be recommended for scheduling under the 1971 Convention, which is the international treaty that we are a party to, along with 180 some countries. And if that happens, then we are obligated to start scheduling procedures here in the United States. It is an egregious breach of the FDA's responsibility here, but they're forum shopping. They cannot win under the Controlled Substances Act criteria, so they're out trying to shop this on an international scale. So we're going to have to launch an important and significant effort to push back on that.
What are the criteria that they use that would make this banned? Like, what are the criteria they're using?
Well, they have to. The FDA would be obligated, or anyone that wants to have input into the expert committee at the WHO, would have to demonstrate that there is a significant harm to the public for this substance to be available, that it is dangerously addictive, that it poses significant risks to the public in terms of safety of either adverse events or death. And they would then have to prove that there is a general health concern about citizens, individuals having access to Kratom products. It's a little lower standard than what we require here in the United States, but there are critical factors in that we are in a great position with respect to the science, because the FDA ignores all of the science. They have one agenda, and that is to expand their regulatory control over Kratom in the United States so that they can clear the pathway for the development of a new drug that would allow for, by synthesizing Kratom's alkaloids, that would allow for a pharmaceutical manufacturer to develop a non-addictive replacement therapy for opioids. And who would do that if you're in the drug industry, if people can go and buy Kratom, in their corner health food store? This is such an end run around both the law and an abrogation of the FDA's duty to provide for the health and well-being of the American people.
And I know the FDA, they tried to ban Kratom domestically in America back in 2016, but we were successfully able to fight that, and they called it off, right?
Well, there are actually two attempts by the FDA. One was in 2016, and they used a section of the Controlled Substances Act called the Emergency Section Powers. They only had to prove 3 of the 8 factors that are required for full scheduling. It was an interesting procedure, because what that section was designed to do is protect Americans against street drugs that popped up on a corner, where they needed to immediately react and stop those amateur alchemists that were developing those dangerous products. What the FDA did is they tried to shoehorn in death data that they claimed was attributable to Kratom over a 6-year period globally. It wasn't what was happening this week on a street corner in America that posed a danger. The FDA's obvious attempt at that point was caught by the DEA, largely because of the outcry from American consumers. And in addition, there was an outcry that came in from the members of Congress that were very heavily involved in actually pushing back against the DEA. 51 members of the House, bipartisan, 26 Republicans, 25 Democrats. On the Senate side, there were 13 members of the Senate, all that reacted very quickly, all within just 2 weeks. And on the Senate side, it's interesting, you had Senator Orrin Hatch, then U.S. Senator from Utah, arguably one of the most conservative members of the U.S. Senate. And on the other side, you had Bernie Sanders, who is arguably the most liberal member. So this was not about politics. This was about good public policy. And the FDA lost on that battle. They came back in 2017 and they filed a full 8-factor analysis. Now, we asked for, they refused to give it to us. A reporter did get a copy of it, only it was sent to him one-sided, and it's a 2-sided document. So we got half the document of what the FDA did. But scientists looked at it and evaluated it and said, what we're seeing, it's not sufficient. But more importantly, in 2018, the FDA commissioner, then Scott Gottlieb, had convinced the White House, had convinced the Department of Justice, had convinced some people at HHS that they should schedule Kratom without any knowledge of the public. And it was only one individual that got a report about it who was responsible for clearing all regulations. That was a deputy chief of staff at HHS. He saw this come across his desk. He had no idea what Kratom was, but they were ready to schedule it. It was polishing the press release. Again, no one knew. No member of Congress knew it. We didn't know it in the public. This was a sneaky attempt to backdoor ban Kratom. So the actual 8-factor analysis has already been submitted. There was no notice by the DEA at that point that they had accepted it. So what happened was this deputy chief of staff asked the assistant secretary for health, then Admiral Brett Giroir, if he would look at it. And Dr. Giroir's first report was, well, I don't know anything about Kratom either, but from what the FDA says, it's very dangerous and we probably should schedule it. That's what he said. And Brian Harrison, who was the deputy chief of staff, said, well, would you do me a favor and look into it? And Dr. Giroir agreed to do that. 2 weeks later, after an extensive review of all of the scientific data, all of the literature, which is what the FDA should have been doing, Dr. Giroir called Brian Harrison back and said, this is horrible science. The FDA has not proven its case, and I agree we should withdraw the recommendation for scheduling. And so for the first time that we've been able to discover in the history of the Controlled Substances Act, HHS withdrew a recommendation that had been submitted and formally and outlined the reasons why. Every American who reads Dr. Giroir's letter will be stunned. He outlines why the FDA failed to meet its case, outlines the new emerging science that challenged the FDA's position, talked about the scientific studies that need to be done before they could prove their case. And then he said, millions of Americans will be put at risk if you ban this substance, because those that are using Kratom today, and we know that they are, and NIDA has recognized there are, and Dr. Giroir recognized it, will be forced on to more dangerous and more deadly opioids. And for those that are currently on those opioids, they're going to go to the black market, if nothing else, and you will increase the number of people who will die in America. Now, what in the world is the FDA doing if they're not there to protect the health and safety of the American people, particularly in the midst of an opioid epidemic where we have people that are dying? And look at what happened between 2019 and 2020. You had a dramatic spike, 30% increase in the number of opioid overdose deaths that happened, drug overdose deaths that happened in the United States. The FDA is blind on this issue, and we know based on NIDA studies that people are successfully using Kratom to wean off of those dangerous opioids. It's helping them. The Johns Hopkins study is powerful. It looked at adult Kratom users in the United States, and they found that 87% of those using Kratom to manage acute and chronic pain that found success in weaning off of opioids because it reduced their withdrawal symptoms. 35% were opioid-free within a year. If you can save the lives of American citizens who are trapped in this addiction cycle, we should be doing it. Our policy should allow it, not banning it like the FDA is trying to do. It is egregious what they're doing, and somebody's got to call a stop to it because the FDA is off the rails on this issue.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. No, I get a little there. So I couldn't agree more with you on that. I've actually seen it firsthand. How I was doing a political polling job at one point, and I was talking to a gentleman at the door. And he was mentioning to me how his son died. And this is what he said. He said he had heroin, fentanyl, and Kratom in his system. But he said the coroner or whoever performed the autopsy said that kratom was what killed him. So he was telling me kratom is what killed him. And I thought to myself, heroin in his system, fentanyl in his system, but kratom is what killed him? And it's just an example to me of how they're trying to smear it. And they're come up with all this fabrication, really. And I didn't know what you said before about how the 26 Republicans and 25 Democrat congressmen, they were actually fighting this. I'm actually impressed they were doing that.
Absolutely. But let me tell you one of the pernicious things that the FDA is doing now. We hear these reports of unfortunate overdose deaths or deaths that occur because individuals get involved with polydrug use. The FDA is trying to label every one of those deaths as kratom deaths when kratom is detected in the bloodstream of a decedent. Now, it is not surprising that if we have this epidemic of drug overdoses, that there may be some people who are using kratom trying to wean off of those dangerous drugs. And if they happen to die because they haven't been successful yet, it would not be surprising that kratom is in their system. But the FDA has gone beyond the pale of any kind of reasonable behavior. We received a call from a coroner in Idaho that indicated that he had an individual who had left an alcohol establishment, was obviously inebriated, may have been impaired by other drugs, walked out into the bitter cold in the winter, fell into a ditch, and died of hypothermia. When the blood tox screen was done, there were a number of substances in his system that would have been obviously impaired him, that would have led to the person falling in a ditch and passing out and led to that death. He also had taken kratom that day, on the day that he died. So that was in the tox screen report. He reported the death as hypothermia. When that was reviewed by the FDA, they called this coroner and said, "We want you to change the cause of death to metrogenine intoxication." And he said, "Why would I do that? That's not what happened." Well, they said, "Because kratom's in his system." He said, "That's not what caused the death. What caused the death was the impairment either of alcohol or these other illicit substances, which would, in fact, at the levels that they were found in the tox screen, led to that person passing out, falling into the ditch, and dying of hypothermia, having been there overnight." The FDA insisted and threatened him that they were going to go to his superiors. And he said, "Fine, do that, because I'm not changing it." Now, if that's what the FDA is doing around the country, you can see why they're pointing at these so-called kratom-associated deaths. They want to jack up the numbers. You look at what the CDC report showed, and the CDC report was a summary of all of the reports that they had received from medical examiners and coroners around the country. And there were 91 deaths that had kratom detected in the bloodstream of the decedent. The CDC looked at all of those deaths. They found that all but 7 of them, based on the tox screen reports that were given to them by the medical examiners, showed polydrug use or adulterated kratom products. There wasn't a question that it was kratom alone, except for 7 that were reported by these medical examiners. So the CDC took those 7 and they took the blood samples. There was one sample that there was no blood, not sufficient blood to do this test, but they applied more sophisticated and more advanced testing to it. And they came up with that the 6 of the 7 for which there were blood samples, all were polydrug use. There was not a single one that was associated with a kratom caused death. So today, we know that there hasn't been, over centuries of use, any identified death related to kratom. Now, I hasten to add here that it's possible that you could overdose on kratom. It's possible. There's some self-limiting factors here. One is that if you take too much of it, you vomit before you hurt yourself. I mean, it's so disruptive to your digestive system. If you were to take a concentrated kratom product, even pure form, maybe you could get it to some dose level, but we haven't seen that yet. Also, there are a lot of people that say, well, what about interactions with other drugs? We don't know what those interactions are. That is true. But we know the only way that you can evaluate that is over a long period of time, use in the community where people are taking drugs for other reasons, and then you observe interactions. There have been no reported interactions between kratom and drugs that people may be taking for therapeutic purposes that are prescribed by their physicians. There's a human clinical trial going on evaluating this right now in the state of Washington. We welcome that. We want good science, but there hasn't been any evidence. And look over in Southeast Asia, where kratom has been used for hundreds of years, and you look at whether or not there's any identified kratom-caused death in Southeast Asia over that entire period of time, or at least in the modern times where they've been keeping records, there are none. So the cooked up story that the FDA is telling is an egregious and outrageous misappropriation of science that the FDA is trying to sell, and they've developed this narrative, and they won't give it up, and they do not care about the science. Look at the evidence that the National Institutes on Drug Abuse developed. One of the criteria for scheduling is that you have to prove that the substance is highly addictive. The National Institutes on Drug Abuse commissioned 2 gold standard animal studies. That's how we determine addiction liability for any substance. Both of those studies, run concurrently but independently, concluded there was no significant addiction liability to kratom. But the second observation they made was that they noticed in the test animals there was a reduction in the cravings for the reference drug. In this case, it was morphine, and that the animals preferred metrogeny because it satisfied them and didn't have the adverse effects. So here, why did NIDA then take those studies, and now they've invested over $30 million in studies, and look at the results of it. Dr. McCurdy, NIDA-funded study, looked at lyophilized kratom tea, and his conclusion was no addiction liability, and there is evidence that it helps to reduce the effects of opioid withdrawals on patients that are using it. Wow, that's the truth of the matter. And yet you have the FDA with their heads in the sand, blindly pushing forward, trying to demonize kratom further and further because they can't get their way for a regulatory scheme.
See, I didn't know the FDA was doing that, but it makes sense. If they're calling the coroners, they're trying to get the cause of death to change. Like, that really is egregious. And if people were to just know this, there'd be no way kratom would be as demonized as it is. And I've also heard, let me know if you've heard this too, but I've heard in France, for example, they're actually trying to patent some of the alkaloids in kratom already. So they're setting it in motion so that if they do succeed in a ban, then they have the alkaloids set to go to make it some sort of prescription drug. Have you heard that too?
Sure. And it's also happened here in the United States. There is a firm that's doing an investigation where they will take an analog of the kratom alkaloids. So it is a chemically formulated, synthesized version of the alkaloids, metrogeny and 7-hydroxymetrogeny. And in fact, there may be other alkaloids in the kratom plant that contribute to its therapeutic benefits for people, particularly at higher doses. And remember, the old adage applies here: the dose makes the poison. Whatever you take, how much you take of it, can determine what the outcomes are. And as I mentioned earlier, you take too much kratom, you end up barfing it. You don't have a problem. All of the safety studies that have been done to date indicate that kratom does not have a safety profile that warrants scheduling because of those factors. There's external factors. And part of that is because of the research that's been done about the psychoactive properties of kratom. The FDA makes a big deal about the fact that kratom's alkaloids bind to the mu opioid receptor in the brain, which is the same thing that opioids do. They're right. We've known that for decades. The question is not whether they bind, but what are the effects of those alkaloids when they bind to the brain? In opioids, we know exactly what happens. It gives you a reinforcing therapeutic high. People love it. It's a pleasure center. They come back to it. Kratom doesn't have that. The second characteristic, signature characteristic of an opioid in the brain is that it goes to your respiratory system and suppresses it. And when you have a respiratory suppression or depression, that's what causes overdose deaths. It's because you literally suffocate. Kratom does not do it. It's called a partial agonist. And so it has the analgesic effects to reduce pain, and it has this well-documented effect of reducing anxiety. And it also gives you a boost in the morning if you take a small amount of it, and increases focus. But it doesn't have any of the harmful signature effects that traditional opioids do. But the FDA doesn't want to make that distinguishing characteristic true. They say, oh, it binds to the mu opioid receptor in the brain. Well, guess what? Chocolate does. Noxolone does, the antidote to an overdose. Cheese does, which accounts for why the Americans love pizza, because it hits that mu opioid receptor, hits that pleasure center. So the FDA is just off the rails when it comes to an evaluation, an objective evaluation of the science here. So these people that are now looking at the potential for a therapeutic, synthetically derived therapeutic agent, God love them. If they can do that and they can then get onto the market and they can have a non-addictive pain therapy at a dose level that is much higher than you find in the natural plant, we're all for that. But don't do what the FDA strategy is to clear the deck to let more people try to be incentivized into doing that simply to make them rich, when people can go out and buy this natural plant on their own, and it ought to be freely available to them. And that it is wrong for the FDA to do what they're doing right now.
Right. I'm big into the freedom to choose what we put in our bodies as citizens of America here. And anything can be abused, right? From whether it's sugar, fast food, alcohol, tobacco. But I don't think the freedoms to take those things should be taken away from us at all. That should be our choice to use Kratom. We can use cigarettes. You can drink alcohol. But just because it hurts some people does not mean it should be taken away from everybody, right? So someone may abuse Kratom, but it's just going to make you vomit. That's self-limiting, as you said. Alcohol, to me, I would say is 1,000 times worse than Kratom could ever be. Same with cigarettes, 1,000 times worse. And so to see them smear it like this, it reminds me of the old expression, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. And there's a lot of instances of that right now. So the FDA, what is the case they're making to the UN right now? And to the, what's the other one, the WHO?
So they're developing the recommendation, or at least a dossier to present to the expert committee at the World Health Organization. And that meeting takes place in October in Geneva, Switzerland. And what that will essentially do is allow the FDA to make their case. Now, they're saying that they're not going to make any specific recommendation. They're only going to present the evidence. Of course, we already know what that evidence is. They have already developed it and used it as the advocacy for scheduling in the United States, which they've been unsuccessful to do twice because they failed to prove their case. In fact, Dr. Joie called it disappointingly poor evidence and data. He outlined 5 specific areas of science that had to be done before the FDA could come back and do it again. So that's why they're in running to the WHO. Now, it's interesting. They put out the Federal Register notice, and by statute, they have to notice the American people that they're doing this. They have to collect comments. Now, we said, great, let's get our comments in. We started to do it. I talked to an FDA official that said, well, wait a minute, because we were trying to coordinate with them how these comments would be collected and how they would be reported to the WHO. He said, understand that the statute obligates us to collect the comments. They obligate us to consider them. We are not going to send them to the WHO. So that's absurd. So we set up an alternate portal through protectkratom.org, and we now are collecting the signatures. And I think right now we're almost at 40,000 signatures.
Good.
5,000 at the federal site, 5,000 or 6,000, and the rest are at our site. We're going to continue to collect those comments through the end of the comment period here on Monday at midnight, and we will then turn them over to the FDA. But we're also going to turn them all over to the World Health Organization. So the procedure that's in place now is that in October, the World Health Organization Expert Committee will determine whether they're going to proceed to what is called a critical review. The pre-review is just everybody gets to come and talk. We will make application to talk. We will have scientists that will be there to talk about the experience that they have seen with Kratom, how it should not be subject to any scheduling procedure or ban internationally. So we'll make our case. The FDA, of course, will make their case. We're hoping that we can find other countries around the world that will stand up and do the same thing that we're going to do to talk about the beneficial effects of having Kratom available to consumers and allowing them to do so, and rebut the claims that are made by the FDA about its safety factor, which they claim that it's unsafe. So what will happen then in October, the expert committee will go into closed session, and they'll take 4 or 5 days, and they'll then recommend whether it goes to a full-blown critical review. If they do that, there's a year period of time between October of 2021 and October of 2022 where they will conduct that review, and we will then have another opportunity to provide input, and we, of course, would aggressively do that if they decide to go to a critical review. If in October of 2022, they decide to recommend to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs that this should be scheduled, that process would take place about 6 months later. And if it is a part of the international treaty, it's called the 1971 Convention, of which we are a party, we will be obligated in the United States to start scheduling procedures through the Drug Enforcement Administration, and it would take an act of God to overturn that. So our fight is with the WHO expert committee to convince these people that the science doesn't justify what the FDA has recommended or any other anti-Kratom forces that might be out there, and that we will load up with as much of the science and as much of the good policy arguments that we can make in Geneva, and then continuing on throughout the year if the expert committee decides to go to a full review. And we hope they do not, but we understand that that may be the influence that the FDA has to get it into a critical review status for that year. And so we'll fight that war. We hope that, again, we don't have to go through it. We'll do our best to fight back.
So the worst case scenario is it goes to that critical review, and then it could potentially be banned, say, 18 months from now. Would that be the worst case, would you say?
It would probably take place in March of 2023, where that decision would be made by the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs.
Okay. And what do you think the likelihood of that happening is?
If the decision is going to be based on science, there's no likelihood of it. If they're going to base it on the combination of science and good public health policy, so even if you're not convinced that the science is overwhelmingly for just dismissing it, the public policy argument that Dr. Joie made about the public health implications of banning the substance ought to be sufficient. There's also a socioeconomic factor involved here. And there's some very interesting sub-arguments. I was on the phone with a group of Indonesian growers and policymakers, and they pointed out to me that if the ban goes into effect, and if Indonesia adopts that ban, that it would require them to destroy upwards of 2 million kratom trees, and the impact on the climate from doing that would be egregious. They also talked about how the livelihood of a very economically distressed area where the growing regions in Indonesia are, that it would have a devastating impact economically on these families because there's no replacement crop that's available to those families to substitute or replace it. And so it would have devastating impacts on the growing regions. And then you look at the public health impacts on the consumers of kratom and the benefits they take, and the fact that they would be forced onto more dangerous substances. That's not good public health policy. So if the expert committee and the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs want to do the right thing on public policy, then they're going to turn their backs on the FDA and say, no, that you couldn't prove it in the United States and you didn't prove it here. And we hope that's the outcome.
Right. And so the WHO and the UN, do you know what their thoughts are on kratom? Like, will they listen to the science, or are they easily influenced by the FDA?
Well, that's an unknown. We've retained some consultants who are very experienced in the area of working with the WHO. The preliminary review we have of it is that these are scientists, and that's good news for us. Now, the influence that the FDA has in the world stage, particularly at the World Health Organization, is enormous. So we're going to have to offset that with good science, and we have some of the world's leading scientists on kratom that will be prepared to present statements and appear personally and to inform this group of scientists about the science-based evidence that kratom is both safe and potentially a valuable therapeutic option that should not be banned. So I'm confident that on the merits of the argument, we will win. Now, if there's politics that are at play that we don't know about, then perhaps we're going to be in trouble. But I hope that we win on that basis. And from what our observations are, the only thing that's happened in the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs was a discussion 2 years ago where some nations expressed concerns about kratom that's based on an emerging psychoactive drug. And all of those comments were traced back to the FDA's disinformation campaign that they were circulating around the world. So all of this comes back to the FDA. And the question is, why? Why is the FDA so hell-bent when they can't prove the science, when it's a bad public policy? Why are they doing this? And of course, we know the answer. It's transparent because it's what they did in 1994 when they were trying to ban all vitamins and dietary supplements to force them into a new drug application process. And the Congress had to step up and say no. And that's why we have the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act today. The DSHEA Act was passed by the Congress, by the way, unanimously, saying to the FDA, you can't force these dietary supplements and vitamins off the market. You have to allow them to go on the market, and that's what the DSHEA Act does. Wow. If the FDA had their way, they would repeal the DSHEA Act today. They hate dietary supplements, even though there are 5,000 dietary supplement products. 80% of Americans use vitamins and dietary supplements in maintaining their health and well-being. It is a $53 billion industry in America. And all that the FDA can say is, well, there's no proof that it helps people, and we think it harms people, but they can't win the day on on the science. And so this is where the FDA is. They are hell-bent to destroy the natural product industry, and Kratom is a bystander in that process, happens to be front and center right now because it's the one that they're going after. But this is part of a larger battle that the FDA has had against the natural products industry for decades.
I actually didn't know that about 1994, but I'm super grateful that they stopped that, because I take a lot of supplements myself. I take Kratom, but I take many other things as well. And so the FDA is sneaky like that, though. They put this stuff in the curriculum of medical schools, of nursing schools, where I've had nurses tell me as they're smoking a cigarette, oh, you shouldn't be taking those supplements because they're not FDA approved. And those guys, they passionately believe that they're right. The people in nursing school, they think, oh, the FDA is not for this stuff, so they must be right. I learned this in school. It must be right. And the most passionate people, and they're the best deceivers because they don't even know they're deceiving. It was taught to them, and they just parrot it back. So I'm hoping, because the evidence is clear, like you said, it's clear how many people Kratom helps. And I just try to get the truth out. And if enough people hear the truth, I think Kratom will be okay. But what are the other things to look out for that the FDA is saying about Kratom? Like, what is part of their disinformation campaign? We talked about the deaths already. Or the lack of deaths, I should say.
We FOIA'd all of the autopsy reports that they claimed, the 44 deaths, and they gave us 43 of them. And we had an independent forensic toxicologist review them. Her conclusion was that these are all polydrug use or adulterated Kratom products or underlying health conditions. None of them could fairly be attributed in any credible way to being a Kratom-caused death. And so that caused the FDA to change the way that they characterize those deaths. To say, instead of saying Kratom-caused, they now say Kratom-associated. The one death that they didn't give us, they told us was not available because the family of the decedent had exercised their right to put a HIPAA restriction, which is the Privacy Act, so we weren't allowed to get that. But interestingly, a reporter from the Huffington Post, a fellow named Nick Wing, was doing a completely separate story on another issue at the FDA and discovered the fully unredacted autopsy report for that death. He matched it up against the autopsy report number on the top. That was about the only thing that wasn't redacted when the FDA gave it to us. And he looked at it, and the actual cause of death of that individual, he had drunk a Kratom tea that day. He was involved in a drug sting where the police ordered him out of the car. There was a discrepancy or a question about what happened after that, but the kid ended up getting shot twice in the torso. The cause of death were 2 gunshot wounds. The FDA claims that is a Kratom-associated death. That's nonsense. But they didn't want us to see it because obviously that's the most embarrassing of them, at least in their view. But
unbelievable.
You look at the other 43, and there are some that are equally as embarrassing. There was a young man who had been released from a mental institution, having suffered from bipolar disorder throughout his entire life. He hung himself a week later. And the FDA called that a Kratom-associated death because even though he had 7 or 8 toxic level of illicit drugs in his system, he was obviously struggling with these issues. He also drank a Kratom tea. And they call that a Kratom death. There was another guy that was swimming in the swimming pool, died of a heart attack, had Kratom in his system, and they called that a Kratom death. This is so out of bounds. And so what is the FDA doing right now? They're shopping for coroners to call deaths Kratom deaths if metrogeny is detected. But what they don't have is a level of metrogenine or 7-hydroxymetrogenine in the bloodstream of anyone who has died to say that that's a toxic dose. They have no proof of that. And in fact, the data that has been accumulated to date shows that in fact, you can't ingest enough to kill yourself, again, unless it's in a synthetic form or extracted in some disproportionate way that would not be an acceptable product. Good analogy of this is caffeine. Caffeine's a drug. It's one of the most widespread drugs in the world, and it is used, and the FDA is not calling for that to be banned, but there was concentrated caffeine tablets that ended up killing some people. And so the FDA appropriately stepped in and said, we're going to ban caffeine in that concentration. Well, fine, do that with Kratom. If you can find a concentration level that actually causes a death, do that. But they want to ban all Kratom. So this is the disproportionate approach that they're taking because it's a natural plant and they want to fight it, and they want control of it. So this is very disappointing from an agency that is required by law to tell the truth. But they say that it's killing people. They say that it's highly addictive, and that's not true. They say it's an opioid. It's not true. just because it's a mu opioid receptor. They claim that there are people that are their lives are being ruined by Kratom. That's not true. I have sat and listened to the testimonies of more than 1,000 Kratom consumers around the country as I've gone around promoting to legislatures the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And those testimonies are compelling. People stand up and say, and by the way, many of these people are afraid to do this. I mean, they're not comfortable speaking in public, and yet they have the courage to do it, to stand at a podium in front of a microphone and say, Kratom has saved my life, or it's improved the quality of my life. It's restored my family to me. It's given me the ability to be, have a job. It's restored my ability to work with my family and to be a good husband and a father. And these are kind of stories that move legislators. They ought to move the FDA, but they don't, because the FDA doesn't give a damn when it comes right down to it. They want their regulatory authority expanded so that they can control this sector of the healthcare market. Hopefully we're going to win on this. We've done so far. We have hundreds of thousands of Kratom advocates who are the real champions in this battle. And we're going to continue to work with them. We're going to tell our story. And that's why these comments are so important that we have right now with the comment period for the WHO.
Sure. And Kratom is just part of the coffee family too. So they don't even like that either, do they?
No, because they would like to say it's genetically an opioid, and it's not. It's part of the coffee family tree. And obviously the alkaloids are different than what you see in the coffee plant. They're different. That's all. They're not harmful. They've been studied sufficiently to say that they can, in the right dose, be perfectly safe. And that's what we advocate for.
Right. And the worst part about the FDA is, as citizens, we have no say in who works for the FDA. They're not like elected officials that we can vote in. They're just people that are there for whatever reason because they're hired. And so as the people, we have no say over what the FDA is doing. And so what do you think is the best place to comment? Is it the protectkratom.org site? Is that the best place to comment because that's the highest likelihood that it'll be seen and taken into consideration?
Absolutely. Protectkratom.org, and you comment there, and every one of those comments are going to be delivered both to the FDA and to the WHO. And we're going to take the FDA's comments and we're going to download them, and we're going to add them to our protectkratom.org list, and we're going to submit all of those comments to the WHO. It is embarrassing that the FDA has taken this posture that the statute only requires them to collect and review them. That's nonsense. The intent of that law was to make sure those comments are made public. And I'll give you another example of where the FDA is playing hide the ball. They just announced that they were, through a request for proposals, to look for contractors to do a study about Kratom. One's a dose finding study. That's a great idea. Let's find out what the dose levels are that are safe for Kratom. And the second is a human abuse potential study. And we looked at that RFP, and some things jumped out right away at us. Number one, contrary to other RFPs that they've done where they're truly trying to find the truth, the FDA says that they will approve the protocol rather than these experienced academic institutions that do this kind of research all of the time, developing the protocol and simply presenting it for tweaks to the FDA. The FDA has said, we will approve the protocol. And secondly, and this is the most important thing, on the human abuse potential study, all of the data that is collected, the FDA says they will own it and it's not available for publication. Now, when a academic institution challenged that and said, we can't ethically be involved in a study where the information is not made available to the public, we just won't do it. And so the best institutions to do this kind of work are excluded from this process. When the request or the complaint was made, the FDA contracting officer said non-negotiable. And when challenged about that, they said, well, we're the ones paying for it. That's what the FDA said. We get to own the data because we're the ones paying for it. Well, that's nonsense. It's the American people that are paying for it. And if the American people pay for a study like that through the FDA, it should be public. But the FDA won't let that happen. Now, what does that tell you? Is the FDA really searching for the truth? Is the FDA really wanting to disclose whatever the outcomes are? They want to cook the protocol so they get the desired outcome, and then they want the option, even after they cook the books and they don't get what they want to hide it if it's not damning to us. So it is as corrupt can get. And we're going to be shining a big spotlight on that nonsense here over the next couple of months. Now, we're obviously focusing on the World Health Organization, but there's another battle, and it's part of an ongoing onslaught of disinformation and improper conduct by the FDA that they're just hell-bent to do, and we're going to be there blowing the whistle on them as best we can and calling out them for what they're doing at this point.
Do you recommend people leaving a comment on the other site too, not the protectkratom.org, but the other one?
No, because we're going to give all of our comments to the FDA, so they'll have them.
Okay.
We know that all that will happen is when we get the FDA comments, we'll have to dedupe them. It's more work for us. So I would encourage people to go to the protectkratom.org comment site, because that's where we'll have the biggest bang, and we'll be able to accumulate them. We won't have as much hassle in deduping them as we go forward.
So I would have to think, though, it's really only the leaders of the FDA that have the biggest problem with it. I wouldn't think the people at the bottom, they would even be so against it. Or it's like, what do you think they're telling them? They just doing what they're told. They believe what they hear. They don't do the research on their own. So, oh, we're fine. We're fine just trying to ban kratom. We're not going to pay any attention to the facts or the science. What are they telling them?
So, Jared, I'm glad you asked this question, because I have a number of friends that work at the FDA, and over the last 4 years, I've developed another set of friends that I didn't know before who are working on this issue. And the vast majority of them are very respectful, and they say, look, we can't explain what's going on here. And since the publication of the RFP, I've talked to 3 of those associates at the FDA, and their comment was, we do not know what in the hell the leadership is doing here. There is no explanation for what they're up to. And what they report to me is that there's one individual that sits at the top of the regulatory bureau there that oversees this research, that is a just locked and loaded against kratom. And he's driving all of this anti-kratom narrative and making these horribly bad decisions that impair the credibility of the FDA, that have really destroyed anyone being able to look at them saying, hey, we can trust what you're doing. There is no trust now. And that's unfortunate, because you ought to be able to trust the FDA.
Absolutely.
You cannot in the current regime that's there. And until, and by the way, you don't have to believe me. You look at what the Assistant Secretary for Health, which under the Controlled Substances Act is the delegated independent official that's supposed to evaluate what the FDA sent. He says they're wrong. Disappointingly poor evidence and data. Then you look at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which by memorandum of understanding between the 2 agencies is responsible for doing all of the human addiction studies, and they've been cut out of this human addiction potential study that the FDA is now doing. They're not even involved in it. Now, how does that build credibility? There needs to be a overarching task force that says all studies on kratom have to be approved by HHS, and NIDA has to be involved, and FDA can be involved. That's what they ought to do. But the FDA is playing hide the ball over here. They're taking our taxpayer money and they're funding a cooked up study that they know that will drive to a conclusion. And if they don't get that conclusion, they want to bury the data. There's something wrong with that story. And so we're going to be fighting hard about that.
I mean, it sounds like they need some accountability. They need some accountability and oversight. And maybe that's where us as the citizens, we can reach out to our Congress folks, the senators, and say, hey, we want oversight for the FDA. We want them to be held accountable for what they're saying, as opposed to just being able to run ripshod and say whatever they want without any consequences. And
that's exactly right.
Yeah, it's outrageous what's going on right now. So I'm praying, as are a lot of other people are praying, that this doesn't happen, right? This ban does not happen, and kratom is continued to be able to be used by everybody. So any other things you'd like to mention about like what's going on in the whole situation here?
Well, we're having some great success in the states, where the states are taking responsibility to make sure that kratom is accessible to consumers, that's safe, manufactured properly, that isn't adulterated with dangerous substances, that is labeled properly, and is not available to children without the consent of the parents. And so those are good things. Now, we did have a setback where in the state of Oregon, even though the Kratom Consumer Protection Act passed unanimously in the House and had only 2 votes against it in the Senate, the governor decided to veto it. And she did so because the Department of Agriculture in the state of Oregon objected to being the responsible agency to take to actually do the enforcement of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And the governor is open. And by the way, the reason they're objecting is, and listen closely, the FDA told them Kratom's really bad stuff. And so they don't want to, because they interact with the FDA all the time, they didn't want to have that contention. So the governor has agreed that if we'll reframe the bill next year and put it under a different regulatory agency, that she will sign it. And so our sponsors there have agreed to do that. The citizens of Oregon are denied the protections that this bill provides for another year, but we're going to have to go through that process, and we'll be back at the Oregon legislature. But we had the state of Oklahoma pass it. In Missouri, we had a unanimous vote in the House of Representatives for the KCPA. We had a unanimous vote out of the Senate General Laws Committee. It was scheduled for floor action. It was only because of an unrelated Medicaid issue that the Missouri Senate adjourned without dealing with our bill. We're going to be back there next year because it obviously will pass. In the state of Texas, it passed the House 133-9, and then it went to the Senate Health Committee. It passed there unanimously. And I rue the day that happened, because I wish someone had voted against it, because when it passed unanimously, it got put on the unanimous consent calendar in the Senate. And then the battle erupted in the Texas legislature about the voting bill and about a lobbying bill of some sort. And the House walked out. And so they left more than 120 bills sitting there and adjourned without action and on the unanimous consent calendar. Ours was one of them. So we'll be back in Texas. Unfortunately, they meet every other year. So I'm sure that we'll get that passed. We're working hard in some other states, including those that are banned right now, because the FDA, through their disinformation campaign between 2012 and 2016, convinced 6 states to ban it. That was a bad public policy decision. We're re-educating those legislators now, and we're going to have some great success there. So we're making progress. And the only thing that gets in the way is the distortions, the lies, and the absolute disinformation that the FDA keeps promulgating about Kratom. And all we can do is stand up and tell the truth. And that's what we're committed to do.
Right. And so that's crazy in particular about Oregon, considering they decriminalized all drugs, and yet they wouldn't even pass this KP Act through.
Yeah.
That is absolutely outrageous that and places like Oklahoma and Texas, they did pass it, but not Oregon. That's unbelievable.
Yeah. So today you have Utah, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Oklahoma that have passed it. Oregon passed it. That's going to get vetoed. So we're making, again, great progress. This is just a tough slug against the FDA's disinformation campaign, and they're fighting tooth and nail at the FDA to try to offset what we're doing as much as they can. So we just keep fighting and slogging along, and we're going to win in the end.
I believe so. And ultimately the end game for the FDA here, is it really just to push more people towards prescription painkillers, to get people on the patents that they make for alkaloids? But you said they didn't even start that process yet here in America. So to me, it has to be financial in some way or another. And it's just sad. It's sad that the FDA is allowing money or whatever other motivations they have to be above the health and the freedoms of the people here in America. It's a tragedy, really. And that's why anything the people can do to help hold them accountable, have some sort of oversight, I think it's needed, because we can't trust the FDA right now. And we're in the middle of a pandemic right now, but we can't trust them. How can you trust what they say when all they do is lie all the time? It's a tragedy. It
is. And when you look at the data that shows the spike in drug overdose deaths at 30% between 2019 and 2020, and you have something that's readily available that could help people, and the FDA is demonizing it and scaring people away from it, that's not good public health policy. That's a tragedy, as you've said. And so I agree. This is something that's going to require the vigilance of every American who believes in freedom, who believes that the FDA should be accountable. They should join us, because right now they're unaccountable and they're trying to rip away our freedoms, and we're going to keep fighting.
Right. And so one last question I have for you. I noticed there are some people who are in abstinent-based, like NA, AA type stuff. Surprisingly, some of them are against Kratom. But what would you say to them? Because they have the dogma of, oh, I just need complete abstinence from everything. But what would you say to those people that to help this conversation along?
So part of this culture of freedom that we have, people are free to make whatever decision they want. And so I can't criticize someone who elects not to use Kratom or even consider it. along the way. I get that. Now, where I do have a problem is when you get groups that are in the addiction recovery business, and they come out and say, "Oh, well, kratom use disorder is a new thing, and the way that we are going to treat people with kratom use disorder who present themselves addicted to kratom, we're going to start treating them with the 3 approved drugs that the FDA has approved for addiction recovery. Those drugs may be useful in treating opioid addictions. They are not useful in creating or treating any kind of kratom dependence. If you have a kratom dependence problem, you take a week and you have a mild headache, a runny nose, and an upset stomach like you would for a caffeine addiction or dependence. And that's all it is. An opioid dependence or addiction recovery program is expensive. It's long-term, subject to lots of relapses. That is not the profile of kratom dependence. And so that's what's unfortunate, because a lot of people are out there who are well-intentioned. Now, I'm not saying the addiction recovery people are well-intentioned. They see this as a profit center. But people who are committed to help those that have addictions sometimes gets sucked into this narrative that the FDA has created that somehow kratom is part of the problem. It is not. It is part of the solution. And so we ought to be focusing on that and helping people as we go forward.
Absolutely, because I know the drugs they would try to put them on, Suboxone, Methadone, Subutex, they are 1,000 times more powerful and addictive than kratom could ever be. And that's why it makes it so flabbergasting that the FDA is doing this when they have all those things that are FDA approved, not to mention benzos, not to mention amphetamines, that they're powerful stuff. And there's tons of deaths every year that involve those prescription drugs.
Right. And then you look at the peer-reviewed published literature that evaluated kratom in terms of the risk of overdose from kratom versus opioids. And Dr. Jack Henningfield published that study along with his colleagues. And the conclusion was that you are 1,000 times or greater at risk for an opioid overdose than you are of a kratom overdose. So if you look at the relative safety, even if you believe that there may be some effects of kratom that are not positive, even if you believe that, and you shouldn't based on the science, but if you do, look at the science. You are 1,000 times or greater, have a 1,000 times a greater risk of overdose from opioids than you ever would from kratom. That tells you the story completely. And for those that are trapped in that addiction level, kratom's a salvation. It's not the problem.
Absolutely. So my philosophy is always, whatever helps people, I am all for. I don't care what helps people. As long as it helps them to be a happier and healthier version of themselves, I am all for it. And I wish others would adapt more of that mindset, as opposed to saying things like, well, it wasn't the way I did it, and so it wasn't my way, so it must be wrong. It's like, no, everyone's going to have a different way. What's going to help you might not help me, and vice versa. So I'm for whatever's going to help people. So in closing here, what other ways the people watching this could they help? Are there places they could donate to, or other things they can do to get involved and make their voice heard?
Well, thank you for asking. Obviously, the comments are important at protectkratom.org. The AmericanKratom.org will accept donations just to fight this battle, amassing all the scientists and to get them there to Geneva to make the presentation and to get other countries weighing in. We've got a PR campaign. We've got lawyers working on this. We've got consultants. That's a $1.6 million effort. We didn't anticipate having to do that. So we're scrambling like crazy to raise money right now to make sure that our voice is heard in Geneva on October the 11th. So we need help from people to go to AmericanKratom.org and make their donations, because every dollar is going to help us achieve that goal and make sure our voices are heard loud and clear by that expert committee in Geneva. It is essential that we do that so that they don't backdoor ban kratom, not only here in the United States, but internationally, because we weren't there to speak up and fight back.
So I'll certainly include that link in the description. Do you recommend people reaching out to their Congress people or the senators as well, or local politicians?
We absolutely do. We have a group called the Kratom Consumer Council that is doing that right now. Every voice, call your congressman, call your senator and say, protect kratom. That's the name of the game. And the more people that do that, the more opportunity we'll have to make sure that the federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act will be filed and passed by the Congress, which will do exactly what the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act did when they restrained the FDA from their over-regulation of dietary supplements. We need to do the same thing for kratom.
Absolutely. Mac, thank you very much for coming on the show here. It's been greatly appreciative to have you on and to inform the people who don't know about what's going on and what we can do to help with Kratom. So thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure, and I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Absolutely. All right, Mac. You guys have a good one. Over and out, everyone.
Thank you.